Some houses hold memories, others keep secrets. But there exists a rarer, more volatile kind of house, one that absorbs the very soul of its owner, becoming a living monument to their triumphs and their tragedies. It holds the ghost of an entire era within its walls. On a winding, sun-scorched road high in the hills above Beverly Hills, there once stood such a place. It wasn't just a mansion, it was a declaration, a fortress of funk, a temple of excess, a laboratory of genius, and, ultimately, a tomb for a dream. This was the home of Rick James. Long after the thunderous music stopped, long after the legions of famous friends and beautiful strangers disappeared, and long after the heavy iron gates were chained shut, this house had one final chilling story to tell. It wasn't a story you could find in the platinum records that once lined the walls, or in the plush, custom-made furniture sinking under a shroud of dust. It was a story told in the silence, a story whispered by the peeling paint, the cracked marble of a bathroom that had witnessed unspeakable violence, and the spectral echo of parties that never truly ended. What does a house know? In the case of Rick James's notorious Hilltop Kingdom, it knew everything. It knew the brilliant wounded boy from Buffalo who willed himself into a king, and it bore silent witness to the ravenous demons that would ultimately help him burn his own kingdom to the ground. To understand the houses, the sanctuary, the fortress, and the final quiet refuge, you must first grapple with the human hurricane who lived inside them. James Ambrose Johnson, Jr., born in Buffalo, New York, on February 1, 1948, was never destined for a quiet life. He was a vessel of explosive contradictions, forged in a crucible of the sacred and the profane. His mother, Mabel, was a former dancer who had worked as a numbers runner for the local mob to support her 8 children. She was a force of nature in her own right, instilling in her son a love for performance and a sharp instinct for survival. Rick grew up as a devout altar boy in the Catholic Church, mesmerized by the high drama of the Latin Mass, the incense, the gilded robes, the solemn ancient chants. He saw the power of spectacle, the magic of ritual. But outside the church doors was a different kind of education. The streets of Buffalo were his real seminary. He was a precocious street hustler, running with gangs, learning the rhythm and the danger of a life lived on the razor's edge. This duality, the sensitive artist wrapped in the armor of a street-tough outlaw, wasn't a persona he adopted later. It was baked into his DNA from the very beginning. His father was an abusive alcoholic who was largely absent, leaving Rick with a deep-seated rage and a desperate, lifelong craving for control and stability. He was, by all accounts, a musical prodigy, a restless, hyperactive talent who could seemingly pick up any instrument and make it bend to his will. But his defining characteristic was his inability to stay still. He was an escape artist. At 15, facing the looming threat of the Vietnam draft, he fled across the border to Toronto, Canada. This wasn't just dodging the draft. It was the first of many flights from authority, from confinement. In the bohemian Yorkville scene of Toronto, a vibrant hub of folk and rock, James Johnson Jr. began his first major transformation. He fell in with a group of musicians that included 2 names that would later become legends in their own right, Neil Young and Bruce Palmer. Together they formed a band called the Mayna Birds. They were electric. Rick, with his explosive stage presence and soulful voice, was the undeniable frontman. Neil Young provided his distinctive jagged guitar work. They were a raw, powerful fusion of R&B, soul, and rock. They were so good that they caught the ear of the biggest music factory on the planet, Motown Records. They were signed, brought to Detroit, and began recording. Imagine for a moment The sheer potential of that lost album, the voice of the future super freak backed by the guitar of Neil Young, produced by the legendary Motown machine. It was destined to be iconic. But Rick's outlaw past, the one he had fled Buffalo to escape, finally caught up with him. Motown discovered he was a draft dodger, AWOL from the U.S. Navy. The label, fiercely protective of its clean-cut image, immediately shelved the album and dropped the band. Just as they were on the precipice of greatness, the project imploded. Rick was arrested. The dream dissolved. It was a brutal lesson, and it became the foundational pattern of his life, a spectacular flight toward the sun, inevitably sabotaged by the gravitational pull of his own chaos. After a brief stint in a naval prison, he drifted. He spent time as a staff songwriter for Motown, learning the craft from the inside, but he was too volatile, too ambitious to write hits for other people. He moved to London, lived a hand-to-mouth existence, always scheming, always composing the funk symphonies that were playing in his head. When he finally returned to the U.S. and re-signed with Motown's Gordy Records, he wasn't James Johnson Jr. anymore. He had completed his transformation. He was Rick James, a self-created myth, a being of pure charisma and audacious talent. He unleashed his sound on the world, a sound he fiercely branded punk funk. It was aggressive, it was raw, it was complex, and it was unapologetically sexual. Songs like You and I, Mary Jane, Bye, and then the culture-shattering Super Freak weren't just records, they were manifestos. He built an empire, a funk dynasty with his Stone City Band, and every king needs a castle. Before the decadent darkness of Hollywood, there was the crisp white snow of home. His first major real estate purchase, made with his first real Motown money, wasn't a glitzy LA showpiece, but a sprawling 100-acre ranch in the quiet countryside near his hometown of Buffalo. This wasn't just a house, it was a profound statement. He had conquered the world, and he was bringing his spoils back home, planting his flag on his own turf. He christened it the Ponderosa, a loving nod to the classic TV Western Bonanza. This place was conceived as his sanctuary, his creative cocoon, an insulated world far from the prying eyes and creative constraints of the Los Angeles music industry. The design of the ranch was the perfect reflection of his country boy, king of the world dichotomy. From the outside, it was a classic American ranch, sprawling and unpretentious, blending into the rolling wooded landscape. But the moment you stepped inside, you were in Rick's world. The interiors were a fantasy land of 70s funkadelic chic. There were acres of deep shag carpeting, massive imposing stone fireplaces that crackled through the long winters, and everywhere the lingering sweet smell of marijuana. He built a state-of-the-art recording studio right in the heart of the home, a creative womb where he could work at any hour, chasing inspiration without the meter running or executives looking over his shoulder. It was here, in the dead of the Buffalo winter, that he and his Stone City Band laid down the tracks for some of his most iconic work, including the legendary album Street Songs. The Ponderosa was more than a house. It was an experiment in communal living, a self-contained funk utopia. He moved his entire family out there, his formidable mother, his siblings, his band members. It was a world unto itself, a place where Rick was the undisputed king, the benevolent patriarch of his own sovereign nation. He wanted to recreate the family stability that had been so absent from his own childhood. His mother, Catherine, was a constant presence, a grounding force who would often cook for the entire entourage. Her quiet disapproval of the escalating drug use a stark contrast to the hedonistic atmosphere her son was cultivating. Even here, in his idyllic rural kingdom, the seeds of chaos were being sown. The parties were legendary, marathon events that could stretch on for days, a stark intrusion of Hollywood decadence into the quiet countryside. The drugs, which Rick had long argued were a vital part of his creative process, were becoming less a tool and more a necessity. The Ponderosa was his attempt to build a wholesome, self-sufficient empire, but he had brought the very lifestyle he was ostensibly trying to escape right through the front door. The sanctuary was slowly becoming just another stage for the ever more demanding persona of Rick James. As his fame reached its absolute zenith in the early 1980s, the ranch in Buffalo began to feel too remote, too small for his colossal ambitions. He was the undisputed king of funk, and a king needed a throne at the very center of the universe. He found it at 8401 Mulholland Drive, a sprawling multi-level mansion perched high in the Hollywood Hills, with a breathtaking panoramic view of the sprawling City of Lights below. This wasn't just a house, it was his fortress of funkitude, a declaration of war on mediocrity. It would soon become one of the most infamous homes in the dark folklore of Hollywood. Mulholland Drive itself is a place of legend, a ribbon of asphalt tracing the spine of the Santa Monica Mountains, a road of movie stars, tragic accidents, and clandestine rendezvous. To have a house on Mulholland was to have arrived. Rick's new home was an architectural product of its time, a bold, modern design with vast plate glass windows, sharp, dramatic angles, and an open, flowing floor plan practically designed for lavish entertaining. But Rick took this architectural canvas and brutally remade it in his own image, transforming it into a Baroque temple to himself. He reportedly poured millions into renovations, creating an interior that was less a home and more a high-concept 24-hour nightclub. Stepping inside was an assault on the senses. The floors were paved in gleaming black marble, cool and forbidding. The walls were almost entirely covered in mirrors, creating a dizzying narcissistic funhouse effect, where his own image and that of his guests was infinitely reflected. The dominant color scheme was a stark, dramatic triad of black, white, and blood red. It was the design equivalent of his music, slick, aggressive, and overwhelmingly sensual. Let's take a tour of this legendary lost space. The main living room, the epicenter of the perpetual party, was dominated by a colossal custom-built white leather sectional sofa that seemed to wrap around the entire cavernous room. It was a throne for his court. In the center, a huge glass coffee table became a notorious fixture. It rarely held art books or magazines. Instead, it was often piled high with mountains of cocaine, displayed as casually as a bowl of fruit. This wasn't a hidden shame, it was a centerpiece, a grotesque symbol of his power, his wealth, and his utter defiance of convention. From there, you could descend into the heart of the house, the recording studio. It was a dark cave-like space, professionally designed and acoustically perfect. This was the laboratory where the mad scientist worked. It was here that he collaborated with his protege and rumored lover, the brilliant Tina Marie. It was here that he coached his close friend, a young comedian named Eddie Murphy, through the recording of his surprisingly successful pop hit, Party All the Time. The studio was a space of intense, drug-fueled creativity. Friends and collaborators recall sessions that would last for days on end, with Rick, a tyrannical perfectionist, pushing everyone to their limits, chasing the sounds he heard in his head. The master bedroom was the inner sanctum, the very soul of the fortress. It was a vast circular room, dominated by an oversized, custom-made round bed draped in black satin sheets. Directly above it, a large mirror was installed on the ceiling. It was the ultimate, almost parodic rock star cliché, but Rick inhabited it with a sincerity that was almost terrifying. This was his stage for private performances, but it was also a place of profound loneliness. He was surrounded by a rotating cast of people, yet he confessed to friends a feeling of deep, aching isolation. The mirrored ceiling ensured he was always watching himself, always performing the role of Rick James, even in his most intimate moments. The personality of the man was seared into every inch of that house. The sheer, unapologetic grandeur, the marble, the custom furniture, the phalanxes of mirrors screamed of his immense pride, a constant broadcast from the poor boy from Buffalo to the world. Look at me now. It was a house built to intimidate, to awe, to overwhelm. But the design also betrayed his deepest insecurities. It was a fortress, deliberately isolated on its hill, designed to keep the world at bay. The reflective surfaces everywhere meant that true privacy was impossible. It was a house built for an audience, even when the only person in attendance was himself. Even the kitchen told a story. Often the warm, beating heart of a family home, Rick's kitchen was described as a sterile, commercial-grade facility. It was not a place of comfort or creation, but a service area, a backstage wing for the catering staff to prepare endless platters of food and drink for the perpetual party. It was another part of the machinery of the Rick James experience, a clear sign that this was not a home in the traditional sense. It was a venue. Yet there was a fascinating little-known exception to the chaos. Hidden away from the main party areas was a small, meticulously organized office. Here, amidst the whirlwind of hedonism, James Johnson Jr., the shrewd businessman, still held court. He kept detailed financial records, studied his own contracts with a sharp eye, and managed his sprawling enterprise. In this one room, discipline reigned. It was a stark reminder that underneath the wild man persona was a brilliant, focused mind. The house contained both men, the pirate and the accountant, locked in a battle for control of the same kingdom. For the better part of a decade, the mansion at 8401 Mulholland Drive was the undisputed apex of Hollywood party destinations. But by the early 1990s, the party had curdled into a waking nightmare. Rick's dalliance with cocaine had spiraled into a full-blown, all-consuming addiction to its most destructive form, crack. The drug seized him. The genius who composed intricate funk symphonies was now a prisoner to the pipe, and his hilltop fortress became his real-life prison, a cage of his own making. In July 1991, the house's reputation shifted irrevocably from famous to infamous. The party palace became a torture chamber. Rick and his much younger girlfriend and future wife, Tanya Hijazi, held a 24-year-old woman named Frances Alley captive for the better part of a week. Fueled by days of drug use, they descended into a vortex of paranoia and sadistic violence. They physically and sexually assaulted her, burned her repeatedly with a hot crack pipe, and subjected her to unimaginable terror. The black marble floors and mirrored walls that had once reflected glamorous partygoers now reflected a real-life horror film. The house that had once stood as a proud symbol of black success and artistic freedom was now a crime scene. Incredibly, just months later, while out on bail for the first assault, Rick did it again. In November 1992, he and Tanya assaulted another woman, a music executive named Mary Sauger, at his West Hollywood hotel room, holding her for nearly a day. The pattern of violence, fueled by addiction, was undeniable. When police finally raided the Mulholland Drive mansion in connection with the first crime, they discovered a scene of abject squalor and decay. The $1 million showplace was a ruin. The plush custom carpets were horribly stained and burned. Expensive furniture was broken and overturned. Drug paraphernalia was strewn everywhere. The air, once thick with perfume and possibility, now hung heavy with the stench of stale smoke and despair. The king's castle had rotted from the inside out, becoming a grim, dilapidated crack den. Rick James, the super freak, was arrested, and his face, haggard and lost, was plastered across every news channel. The trial was a media circus that laid bare the sordid details of his fall. He was eventually convicted of assault and false imprisonment and sentenced to 5 years in Folsom Prison, the very same institution where Johnny Cash had famously performed. The irony was staggering. The funk superstar who had built a career on themes of freedom and rebellion was now a number in a cage. During his 2 years of incarceration, the house on Mulholland sat empty, a silent, decaying testament on the hill. It became a dark tourist attraction, the abandoned Rick James house. The sun-drenched pool turned into a stagnant pond. The manicured gardens became a jungle of weeds. The house itself seemed to be collapsing under the weight of its own dark history, a chilling metaphor for its owner. Released from prison in 1996, Rick James was a profoundly changed man. He was humbled, his health was shattered, and he was desperate to reclaim not just his career, but his soul. He spoke with startling candor about his addictions, expressing deep remorse for the crimes he committed and the pain he caused. The first and most crucial step in this rebirth was to sever ties with the past. He sold the Mulholland Drive property, unable to even set foot in a place so saturated with his own ghosts. He attempted to rebuild his family life. He had married Tanya Hijazi while they were both embroiled in their legal troubles, and they had a son together, the youngest of his children, Tasman. He already had 2 older children, a daughter, Ty, and son, Rick James Jr., from previous relationships. He fought to be a present father and grandfather, to offer a stability he himself had never known. This desire for a new life was reflected in his final home. He moved into a modest, unassuming house in the San Fernando Valley, a world away from the Gothic grandeur of his former fortress. The contrast between the Mulholland Palace and his final home could not be more stark. It tells the entire story of his final years. The fortress on the hill was his war room, his public stage, his hedonistic playground, and ultimately, his prison. It represented his boundless ambition, his colossal ego, and his spectacular self-destruction. The quiet suburban house in the valley was a sanctuary, but a far more fragile one. There were no marble floors, no mirrored walls, no 24-hour parties. It was a place of beige carpets and quiet nights, a house that belonged not to the myth of Rick James, but to the man, James Johnson Jr., who was trying to find his way back to himself. For a brief, shining moment, it seemed like he might succeed. The unexpected and explosive revival of his fame, thanks to Dave Chappelle's iconic sketch, brought him a new generation of fans and a renewed sense of relevance. But the years of hard living had taken a devastating toll. On the morning of August 6, 2004, Rick James was found dead in that quiet suburban home by his housekeeper. He was only 56 years old. The coroner's report was a brutal litany of his life successes, citing pulmonary and cardiac failure with a cocktail of 9 different drugs in his system. No single drug was at a lethal level, but their combined effect on his ravaged body was fatal. He died alone, in his bed, in a quiet house. The end came not with a bang, but with a whisper, a universe away from the thunderous applause and deafening chaos that had defined his life. What, then, is the legacy of these houses? They are far more than just brick and mortar, more than just assets in a celebrity portfolio. They are the physical chapters of a modern American tragedy. The Ponderosa in Buffalo was the chapter of youthful hope, a flawed attempt to build a kingdom on home soil. The palace on Mulholland Drive was the epic chapter of glory and damnation, a story of genius and madness played out in leather, satin, and cocaine. And the final quiet house in the valley was the somber epilogue, a desperate search for redemption that was tragically cut short. The infamous house at 8401 Mulholland Drive no longer stands. It was eventually purchased, demolished, and completely erased from the landscape, replaced by a new, anonymous modern mansion. The ghosts were exorcised by bulldozers and architects. But the story remains, a cautionary tale whispered on the Hollywood wind. It is a story about how the spaces we meticulously create can, in turn, create, define, and sometimes destroy us. For Rick James, the house on the hill was the dream he built with his own hands, and the trap that ultimately consumed him. It was a place where a musical visionary reached for the sun, and where a deeply wounded man fell back to earth, leaving behind only the immortal echo of his music and the haunting, profound silence of empty rooms. We're done for today. Thanks so much for watching. If you found this helpful, smash the like button, comment below, and hit subscribe for more great content coming your way soon.